We've been studying our way through Ephesians in this hour, and we're going to be continuing today in chapter 6. We've looked at husbands and wives, fathers and children. And what we see in these things is that the instructions that God gives us will transform our lives. So when we see husbands and wives, we're told to look at Christ in the church. And as I mentioned in that lesson, the bar is set very, very, very high as it can be set. And if we really embrace those instructions and live them out in our lives, it would really change our lives. And in fact, that's the whole idea of being a Christian, is to be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And I don't know how often we think about that as it applies to on the job. But from what I read, looking up online, people spend approximately a third of their life, the average person, 90,000 hours at work. I'm sure if you're one of those people who has a regular kind of full-time job, you can understand that. Just think of the amount of time of your day and your week and then of your life you're going to spend at the job site, on the job, doing your thing, whatever it is you do. A huge portion of the time. So when you think about letting your light shine and how being a Christian will affect your life, the impact of that at work proposes an enormous opportunity to let our light shine and to let the Lord work in our lives so that we can be an influence on people around us. And so today we're going to look at how these instructions apply to workers today. Let's read verses 5 through 9 of Ephesians chapter 6 as we begin, and then we'll back up and kind of go through it a little more slowly. Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. Masters, do the same to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. So right off the bat, let's address the fact that he starts this off with bondservants. That word could be translated slaves, but slaves brings a whole lot of other baggage with that may not apply in this first century context. People could become bondservants in a number of ways. They could just be slaves. You could be born into that type of role. But you could also sell yourself if you fell into debt to work for somebody else. That's the nature of that bond servant. Like you're having to work for them because of something that is owed. And then you have this servant-master relationship. It does not translate exactly to our modern world here in America. So the employee-employer relationship is not exactly like a servant-master relationship. I think we understand that. But even here, he even mentions when he's making the application of that in verse 8, that you'll receive the reward whether you're a bondservant or free. And I think that these principles that he gives us apply to any relationship where we are working for someone, and specifically in this case, if there's an authority structure. So one of the things that makes this fit into the context is the authority structure. He talks about the authority structure in the marriage, the authority structure in the home, and then here it's the authority structure at work, let's say. And in their day, you had a lot of people who had a master-servant relationship. For us, unless you work for yourself or you do your own thing, if you work for somebody else, then there's probably an authority structure in your workplace as well. And if so, then I would suggest to you these instructions would apply. If you stop and think about it, if a bondservant, if somebody in that relationship needed to live by these principles, why wouldn't it apply to someone who chooses freely to work for somebody else in a relationship where you say, I'll work for you and they're going to pay you and you're going to do this job? Then I think these same principles, will apply. So with that in mind, let's kind of take it like one phrase at a time and just think through how this would affect us if we put these into practice while we are working. So the first one is, he says, we already went over bondservants. Then he says, obey. We've seen this already in the other examples of authority. Where there is authority, the Lord expects us to be submissive. That's a big part of being a Christian, is being submissive to the governing authorities in the church, in the home, and on the job site as well. To be submissive to the authority that is in place, to be respectfully obedient to what we are told to do. Now, then he goes on to say, with fear and trembling. Clearly what that's indicating here is a respectful attitude toward the authority structure that is in place. A lot of respect is missing from so many facets of life. I think we've all witnessed that. Respect in the classroom, respect, for teachers, respect for people in government, respect for the authorities, the police, respect, just any kind of authority structure. It seems like the respect is eroding for those in our society. People are just becoming more and more openly disrespectful toward authority structures. And I'm sure that could be true in the workplace as well. But to let our light shine, to be a Christian worker is to be not only doing what we're told, but also to do it in a way that is respectful of the authority that is there. And then he says, with a sincere heart. Our service and our work that we do is to be done sincerely, not as something that is half-hearted or fake. It's not an act, but it's something that we do, and we are devoted and we are genuine in what we do. I was thinking about these examples of, you've probably seen pictures of like, that's not my job kind of thing. And so here's a couple of examples of somebody that wasn't their job. It wasn't the guy painting the stripes job to move the brush out of the way. It wasn't this painter's job to move that pot a little bit before he finished doing his job. This is not an example of working sincerely, or working earnestly or really genuinely trying to do the job you've been given to do. It's sort of more of a half-hearted, malicious compliance kind of thing. Yes, I did what I was told, without, having really sincerely trying to do a good job. By contrast to that, he says, as you would Christ. And so just as we've looked at our relationship with Jesus to understand marriage even better, and we can look at our relationship with God to understand parenting. We did that in the last lesson. Imagine, it's really hard to imagine this, but just imagine that if somehow you had the opportunity here in this life to meet Jesus, like if you lived at the time when Jesus was alive and you knew who he was and you believed in him and you knew that's my Savior. And imagine if he asked you to do something. Just think of the gusto you would have if he said, would you go over and do this? Just any little task. If he asked you to go do that, go get something ready, go set something up, go move something from here to there, whatever. I mean, we would just joyfully, right? We would, whatever we can do for Jesus asked me to do it, then I'm going to do it. But notice that that's exactly what he's saying. This is hard. I think this is hard to keep this mindset in mind, that working for a man, working for the man, working for an earthly master to serve them as we would serve Christ. And he's going to hammer down on that point. He's not done emphasizing that as we go along. So he says, not by way of eye service as people pleasers. This shows us this is kind of a timeless problem, that it was a problem way back then. I guess there have always been and always will be people, and maybe you can think about yourself. Has this ever been true of me? Has this been true of you? That we work a certain way when we think people are watching, and another way when we think nobody's watching. A friend of mine, his dad worked at a GM plant in near Decatur, and he always liked to play pranks on these guys. And there were some guys that didn't work very hard. So he got a shoebox and a little, remember the little canisters that 35 millimeter film would come in? And so he glued that to it, and he painted it black, and he put a little LED light and a 9-volt battery in it, and he mounted this thing up somewhere, after hours. And then like the next day they came into work, and he's over there and he tells the guy, he said, hey, don't turn around. But there's a camera over our shoulders. And the guy's like, really? Yeah. And so a little bit later, he kind of looks around, and he said they just went to working and working. And then the next thing you know, these guys in white shirts came out, and it was the union stewards. And they were about to cause a big ruckus with the company because apparently that wasn't in the contract that you can have cameras watching people. And so they found out that it was all just a prank, and then everybody could go back to, being relaxed again or whatever. But while they thought somebody was watching, boy, they got to work. And that's the idea here, that we should not just be hard workers when we think somebody's got their eye on us, or when the boss is at work and as soon as he walks out of the room, it's back to joking around and not doing our job. We need to be sincerely working, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but again, he comes back to this, as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. So when you think about it, that's a hard attitude to embrace. What we need to realize is when we're doing these things, we're not doing it for the company or for the man or for whatever. We're doing it because we are submitting to God. This is God's will. This is what God has told us to do. And if we're following Jesus, we want to submit to him. So we can do that on the job, on the clock, by carrying out these instructions and working with the mindset that I'm doing this because I'm submitting to the will of God. I'm doing this because I'm a bondservant of Jesus. I'm doing this because I work for Christ. There are companies that have like staffing companies, and they provide workers to other people who need employees for whatever reason. And so, if that company needs to hire some people, they might go through like a staffing company, and the staffing company sends people there to do this job. So imagine if we work for Jesus staffing company, in a sense, right? And imagine you've got like a little polo on, and it says, I'm a Christian. And then we get loaned out to people to do work, but really we work for the Lord. And that's what he's describing here. Like, our real boss is Jesus. We're just doing a job for somebody else, but we really report to Jesus. He's who we work for. He's who owns us. We're his bondservants. We've just kind of been lent out to do with this job, whatever it is that I've been asked to do. But I'm here representing Jesus. I'm here to do the work, and I'm here to be a bondservant of the Lord. Would that change my attitude on the job? Would it change your attitude? Would we work a little differently if we really put this in our hearts and minds and then try to live by it? I suspect that it would change the way that we work if we're not already thinking along those lines. Then he says, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man. This goes along with a sincere heart, I think, meaning having the best interest of the master in mind, doing, not just that malicious compliance, like, yes, I'll do what I was told, even though, it's not going to be helpful or whatever, but doing things with a good will, sincerely. And I think it also involves in what Paul wrote to Titus here. He says in Titus 2:9-10, bondservants are to be submissive to their masters in everything, well-pleasing, not argumentative, not pilfering, showing all good faith, so that in everything they may adorn the doctrine of God our Savior. That not pilfering, that's not a word we probably use a lot so I checked another translation. I think the King James says not purloining, and that's even more rare. So you got between purloining and pilfering, these are not words we use a lot. But basically it means taking stuff, like cheating the company. And there's a lot of ways you can do that. There's people, I used to work at a place where they had people check in everybody's lunchbox as they walked out, because employees would take stuff and literally take it home. And so then as they would walk out, they had to, not people, not me, thankfully, but people had to open their lunchbox and show that they didn't have something that belonged to the company as they're walking out the door. That's pretty sad, but that would be pilfering. But there's other ways you can do that. You can cheat the company on your timesheet. You can cheat the company in other ways where you bend the rules and break the rules to benefit yourself at the expense of who you're working for. And that would be the same thing as picking up something that belongs to them and taking it out in your pocket. If you're taking things that are not rightfully yours or you don't have a right to have, if that shows up in your paycheck every week, that you didn't rightfully earn it, then I would suggest that that's the same thing as pilfering, or what he's talking about here. So if we're serving rendering service with a good will, then we're not going to be doing that kind of thing. And while I have this Titus passage on the screen, I want to point out that he says, showing all good faith, so that in everything they may adorn the doctrine of God our Savior. That's kind of a long way of saying that our light will shine. But if we embrace this kind of work ethic and attitude when we are working for others, then it makes the doctrine of God adorned. So an adornment is like a jewelry. It's like a way to make something pretty. And if you're adorning the doctrine, if people know that you're a Christian and then they work with you, and this is the kind of worker you are, you make the doctrine of Christ attractive to other people because they think very highly of you. And that makes it a thing that is attractive to people. You can imagine, although he doesn't say it, what the flip side of that would be, right? What if you're a terrible worker or dishonest or lazy and you wear the name of Christ, like you've got your, Christian polo on, so to speak, but you're like terrible to work with and disrespectful and all those things. Then, of course, that would take away from the adornment of the doctrine of Christ. Now, let me catch up in my notes here. As to the Lord and not to man, this is just emphasizing what we already saw here, as you would Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. So this is like the third time that he's emphasizing this, I think, because especially imagine the challenge if you were addressing actual bondservants and masters. Think about this. You're talking to people who are bondservants who have no choice in the matter, and you're trying to convince them to work for their master with this kind of attitude. How would you motivate people in a practically slave-master relationship to work heartily with a good attitude, to render good service? I think you would have to convince them, or it would help to convince them, that when you're doing this because of your devotion to Jesus and because you're a Christian out of service to God and to the Lord, not to man. Don't think about that guy that's your boss or that lady or whoever, but think about the Lord and do this as if you were serving the Lord. And that will help us to embrace this attitude of service. Then he reminds us that there is a reward for this, that we will be rewarded for our labor. Imagine how beneficial that would be to the bondservant, to the someone like a slavery kind of setting, where they don't get a paycheck, they don't get a bonus, they don't get overtime. They just have to do whatever they're told to do, and that's the arrangement, But there is a reward for us if we are doing these things out of service to the Lord, because he is going to reward us in the end, and we can trust in that, and it makes all the work and all the effort worth it. You might think about people today who have who get a big payday all of a sudden. I thought about athletes, and sometimes people really complain about the big bucks that they get. Suddenly, on draft day, they go from being whatever to being, immediately a huge payday. And it does seem like sometimes maybe it's a ridiculous amount of money. But what's probably not seen are the years of effort that they put into trying to get to that spot. I'm watching my brother try to make it in professional basketball, or that was his goal as a little kid. When most people were inside playing or whatever, he was outside in the rain. He was outside at night. They parked the van in front of the goal, and he would shoot over the van. And he made friends with the custodian at the school, so he would let him in before the school was open. He would be in the gym before anybody was allowed in the school, shooting. When they would come back from away games, everybody would get ready to go home. He would go back out on the court and just practice. I mean, that was for years and years, because he had a goal. And mom and dad have like a little thing he drew. That was his goal from when he was a kid, to make it to the NBA, but he never did. He didn't quite make it to the NBA. He's playing, overseas, but he didn't make it to his goal. But if he had made it to that goal and signed that contract, then all that work in a single day almost, here's your payday for the years of labor and effort when everybody else was goofing off or running around with their friends. all the work that was put in the gym, in the weight room, would suddenly you to get a big payday. And that's kind of the motivation. And that's the way that we need to think about serving Jesus, especially if we don't see the reward on an earthly basis. Because maybe you would work this way and you would put all these principles into effect and you would hope that it would be recognized and valued, and maybe it will be. Maybe people would see that this is something that we want to promote you or reward you or give you extra because you're working the way that this describes. But maybe they don't. And maybe somebody else gets promoted, or maybe somebody else makes more money or is more successful. So how do you keep going? And I think we have to have that long-term reward in mind to keep us motivated that we're going to serve God. We're doing this for the Lord anyway. We're not doing it for a raise or a paycheck. We're doing it because we're serving God. But we know that in the end, He is going to reward us, and that reward will put any earthly reward to shame. I wanted to look at an example of somebody that I think really embraces this, and I don't have it on the screen, but let's turn to Genesis 39. I think Joseph is this exact kind of worker that we're reading about. And his story kind of illustrates these principles and what we're talking about, the way he did it, I think, out of faith in the Lord. Now, you remember Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery. So he actually was a slave, was purchased by a man to work for him. And he shouldn't have been there. He didn't, it's because his brothers did him wrong that he was sold into slavery. Imagine trying to come up with the right attitude to have when you've been sold by your brothers into slavery and now some foreigner buys you and he owns you. And now he starts giving you instructions on do this and do that. What kind of attitude would I have in that setting? Would I give it 100%? Would I be respectful and happy to be there? I think it'd be tough to have the right attitude. But notice what we read about Joseph in Genesis 39, 1 through 6. Joseph had been brought down to Egypt. Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph. He became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house, put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer of his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in his house and his field, so that he left all that he had in Joseph's charge. Because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food that he ate. So Joseph proved himself to be very trustworthy, very reliable, very dependable, very honest, so that his master could just turn things over to him and have complete peace of mind, knowing that if Joseph's in charge of it, it's in good hands. And I really feel like if we embrace the biblical teaching of how we should conduct ourselves when we're working, we should be like Joseph, a blessing to the people wherever we go, because they're going to know that here's somebody I can depend on, here's somebody who's honest, here's somebody who's sincere, they're going to do the right thing, they're going to work hard regardless of whether somebody's watching them. You would be a blessing to the people you're around, just like Joseph is. And we all know Joseph's story, how he ended up in the end being blessed by God and elevated and, put in charge of half the country. And the same thing is true for us. If we just follow these instructions, we know that we will be pleasing to the Lord, and one day we will be rewarded by him. Now, the next verse, back to Ephesians 6, we'll just touch on this briefly. The next verse, it shifts to the masters. Oh, I forgot I had this one. Colossians 3. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men. Same thing. Knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. The wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done. There's no partiality. This gives us the flip side of it. If we're, cheating or doing the wrong things, we'll have to answer for that as well. But this first part just echoes what he says here to the church at Ephesus, that we should work heartily as for the Lord and not for man, knowing that we will receive the inheritance as your reward. Now, the last verse that I was going to is verse 9. He switches to talk to the masters. Masters, do the same to them and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there's no partiality in him. So this should probably send a little chill down their spine. He says, do the same to them. So if all the things that you read about the way that the servant should be toward their masters. He says, masters, you be the same. And stop threatening. Don't abuse your power. Recognizing that person who's working for you and you both have a boss, and he shows no partiality. He doesn't care who you are. He doesn't care, that you're the wealthy person, that you're the one that was, that it's in charge. You're all going to be judged the same by the boss, the true master. So I don't know where each of us is or will be in your career, but it might be that at times you've got someone in authority over you, and there may be times when you're the one who's in authority over others. But in both cases, we should do our job mindful of the fact that we're serving Christ, that He is our master, and try to live out these principles. And when you consider that, and imagine the kind of worker and the kind of boss that this would make, if we really embrace this, just like when we think about marriage, if you really embrace these principles, it's going to lead to the ideal situation. You would be the ideal employee. And you hear about these days, everybody has a hard time finding people who will work. They have a hard time finding people who will show up, who will put their phone away, who will just do their job. People have done this thing where they call quiet quitting, where they get just kind of frustrated and they show up for work and get a paycheck, but they don't do anything. It's just terrible. I hear it all the time from employers, the trouble they have finding good workers. And in fact, I've told our kids, if you will just show up and work and be responsible, like, the world is your oyster, because there's so many people. That's all they're looking for, is somebody who will be there and do the job. But if we take these principles and apply them, and if we work hard and we work like we're working for the Lord with a good attitude, respectfully, honestly, with a goodwill, sincerely, if you embrace all of that and you bring that to you, then you're going to be the kind of worker, I think, like Joseph was, where you're a blessing to the people around you. Are you guaranteed that somebody's going to recognize that and reward you? Nah, they may not. It doesn't always work that way. You hope it will, but it doesn't always work that way. But you can be guaranteed that the Lord will reward you. You know that for sure. And on the other hand, if you're the boss, and you're the kind of boss that this describes, if you're a boss who is caring and mindful of your people, recognizing that you answer to a higher power as well, then that would be the kind of boss that everybody should want to have as well. So I think when we as Christians go out into the workforce, which is where a lot of us will spend a huge chunk of our life, if we will embrace this teaching and put it into practice, it will really transform us and allow us to adorn the doctrine of Christ and let our light shine wherever we may go. If there's anyone here this morning who needs to make something right in your life, we want to conclude with this invitation that we'd be glad to pray for you. If you need to have your sins washed away, if you need to make something right in any way that we can be assisting you, let us know while we stand and sing.
Sinner Jesus will receive soundless word of grace to all, through the heavenly pathway lead, all who linger, all who fall, singing o'er again and o'er again. Christ receive the sinful man, make the man sincere and plain. Christ receive the sinful man. Come and He will give you rest. Trust Him, for His word is plain. He will take the sinful less. Christ receive the sinful man. Sing it o'er and o'er again. Christ receive the sinful man. The sinful man. Make the message clear and plain. Christ receive the sinful man. Even me with all my sin, purge from every spot and stain, and within I enter in, singing Lord, and Lord again. Christ receive the simple make the message clear and plain. Christ receive the simple Be seated, please.
Debbie comes forward this morning and she said that she was baptized when she was a teenager and she doesn't believe she did it for the right reasons. She wants to make sure that she's done that for the Lord and done it out of faith, and that He knows that that's what she wants to do. So we want to be sure that we can relieve her conscience about that and she can feel good about it. I can relate to that. I've been there myself, and I don't know, probably some of you have as well. But we're going to take care of that now. So we'll have Debbie, you want to step up here for just a second?